Hey everybody, and welcome back to now our second edition of ClearView Convos, a new podcast series of sorts that we're starting up, trying to feature candid conversations across members of our leadership team with diverse pockets of expertise on critical issues affecting the landscape of innovation today in biopharma marketplace. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by a number of leaders within our Vaccine Center of Excellence. These gentlemen work across a number of operators, bringing innovative therapeutic approaches, therapeutic and prophylactic approaches to the vaccine space. And we're going to pick their brains today on all of the uncertainty we're seeing in U.S. government affairs and what it means for vaccine manufacturers and innovators going forward. Maybe I'll start with a quick round of introductions. I'll ask Andrew, then Kai, and Seth to each introduce themselves. Gentlemen.
Great. Thanks, Sam. My name is Andrew Kang. I'm a managing director out of our New York City office. And as Sam mentioned, part of the leadership team that oversees our internal Vaccine Center of Excellence.
I'm Kai-Ming Pu, partner based out of our Boston office, along with Andrew and Seth help lead the Center of Excellence.
And hi, everyone. Seth Berman, another partner in the Boston office, and as mentioned, one of the co-leads and co-founders of the Vaccine Center of Excellence, along with Andrew and Kai.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for making the time today. I'm thrilled to have you here on ClearView Convos. Maybe to start, obviously, say going back to Q1 of 2020, we've been on a little bit of a wild ride in the vaccine world, and COVID clearly at the centerpiece of that. It does seem like there's never a dull day right now in terms of evolving guidance and language and direction that's coming from FDA, from CDC around this space. Maybe can we start with just a summer, and maybe Seth, I'll ask you if you can help us understand, like, how is COVID being approached from a regulatory perspective right now? What have been some of the recent changes that we've seen relative to what happened during the course of the pandemic itself?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to start. I'll focus this more on the CDC side and what's happened over the past several weeks. So in terms of COVID specifically, which there's a relationship to, but a little bit different than thinking about vaccines broadly, which maybe we can get to in a second. But for COVID, really the biggest changes over the past few weeks is first and foremost with respect to 50 to 64 requirement for post-marketing studies, and most likely that will also mean no longer needing immunogenicity. That's not definitive, but my guess at least would be that you're going to need some clinical endpoints there. And that's going to follow through with anything moving forward for individuals younger than 50, and now inclusive of what just came out the past 24 hours, where the CDC is no longer going to recommend routine annual vaccinations for COVID for pregnant women or for kids.
Fantastic. Really helpful to hear. From a regulatory bar perspective, maybe Andrew, I'll ask you to weigh in as well. How does this compare to sort of historic approaches? You mentioned sort of the placebo control component relative to immunogenicity. Like, how much is this a change from how COVID's been handled in the past? And how should we interpret that both for COVID and then I guess beyond as well?
Yeah, it's a great point, and we even saw the continuation of that emerging policy even today. When the routine recommendations were pulled for COVID for healthy children, pregnant women, which, to your point, Sam, is actually pretty consistent with how most of the major markets around the world approach seasonal respiratory immunizations in their populations, even in countries such as the UK and Japan, where regular yearly annual immunizations aren't necessarily always routinely recommended in children and healthy adults from 18 to 49 or 18 to 64. So this actually isn't that inconsistent with what we normally see sort of in global markets. However, the question then is, will this be extrapolated to other seasonal respiratory conditions such as influenza? I think our sort of general thinking is you can't really rule it out until it actually happens. And so there's a great deal of planning around that needs to be done. However, one thing that we've been thinking and discussing for a while, at least on the influenza side, is unlike COVID, there is an enormous body of evidence that dates back decades on disease burden, on the influence and impact of immunizations, at least for a disease like influenza. So while there is technically a greater body of evidence, we've also seen sort of decision makers, scrutinize and ask for additional data. So we can't rule it out, and it's definitely something that should be built into contingency plans, especially for novel flu vaccines or even novel combination vaccines that we know are in development now.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe, and Kai, I'll ask you then. I think Andrew spoke to this a little bit, but how much should we extrapolate this guidance as being meaningful beyond COVID, right? It's certainly, I've heard others say that it is a return, if you will, to a gold standard. How much is this, the vaccine world is getting harder than it used to be in 2020, and how much of this is it's getting back to where it was in a pre-pandemic world?
It's ultimately, I think, back to where it was, right? If you look at, and it's not technically written in stone guidance, but if you listen to the words that are being said and sort of the spirit behind them, it's fundamentally, we want to test things against placebo and we don't know if they work or not, which is what we always do, right? Every new vaccine that's in development that's novel against a novel pathogen is going to get tested against the placebo. We have nothing else to test it against, and that's going to remain the case going forward forever. The question will be, if you're somebody developing one of these next generation types of vaccines and a pneumococcal, shingles, influenza, right? How do you approach it there? But even there, our expectation is not that you're going to be asked to run a placebo-controlled study. Like, that would be an impossible study to enroll. It's not an ethical study. But you're still going to be testing against what exists on the marketplace today. What it really means is, for everyone developing for something that's brand new, that's when you're doing placebo-controlled studies, but that's what you're going to do anyways. And so from our viewpoint, for those who are sort of not still in the space, investing in the space, doesn't actually fundamentally change how people are thinking about executing clinical trials, the comparators or anything like that. It is, really just business as usual, despite the noise around it.
No,
maybe Sam, if I could jump in for one, because I'm thinking about what Kai just mentioned and then a comment that Andrew made, right? Like the business as usual, predominantly from a regulatory perspective, FDA, I think we understand what that means for most cases. But, Andrew, you mentioned the decades of information and knowledge experience we have in flu, and yet just a few months ago or less, right, CDC canceled meetings and didn't make a recommendation for the next season. And FDA came in using WHO recommendations and basically said, here's what manufacturers should go after. So to me, that suggests a possible interesting implication, potentially not always in a good way, for what does that mean for vaccines moving forward, even if they get FDA approval. What is CDC, what is ACIP, what is CDC going to do, and what does that mean if you're a manufacturer of vaccines? How do you play in this market, in this space moving forward?
I think the uncertainty is probably the biggest issue in the space today, right? It's not necessarily one of the science, it's not necessarily one of the development, it's the uncertainty, and uncertainty is going to scare away investors and all of that, and so it's going to make it harder for people to access the capital they need, and these are large capital intensive studies that are required. So that's what I sort of view as one of the biggest challenges for people, less so the actual execution of trials and things like that. It's more, where are we going to get the money to do these things?
Yeah, and I was going to build up on what you said and ask one more sort of targeted question before we move on, which is for non-seasonal vaccines that are sort of like dominant cornerstone products that are out in the marketplace right now. Like, I think for innovators that are maybe taking novel technologies in those spaces, certainly the bar we already knew was going to be high. I did want to clarify, I don't think we've heard anything explicit yet from FDA, CDC, or otherwise on a differential long-term safety bar for innovative technologies, right? Because we heard so much around, mRNA, it's so new, we don't know, and we're still 5 years into human data around mRNA and its inflammasome profile. But I want to be clear, we have not heard anything to date around suggesting, a comparative study against a precedented vaccine, there's going to be a heightened safety bar, for example, around innovative technologies compared to historicals. Is that fair, or is that not clear?
I think that's fair at this stage, right? We haven't heard anything to suggest that the actual people sitting there doing the reviews are holding things to a different standard at this stage. I think it is worth keeping in mind for anyone developing in this space that there will probably be more at least public scrutiny on some of these pieces. And if that means larger safety databases, things like that, maybe that is something to plan against. But at least from a purely regulatory standpoint, we have not heard the bar being higher, nor do we expect it in terms of the actual individuals running the review processes themselves to be meaningfully different than where it exists today.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
I
at the
think
end
that's
of the
right.
day, in the vaccine space, like it's pretty standard for, after approval, after recommendations for manufacturers to be motivated to continue gathering real world evidence, generating additional data. So that's largely the norm anyway. But to Kai's point, just being maybe a little bit more strategic about the kinds of data that we're going to generate. Should we go out of our way to just in case, like collect more sort of safety endpoints than we typically might be? Sort of planning for, probably a prudent move, at this point moving forward.
Yeah. And I mean, I think if you think about like Moderna with CMV, you're going to do placebo anyway. If you're Pfizer going after CETA, if you're doing placebo as a comparator anyway, I think where it gets interesting, because Sam, you're right, there's nothing definitive to say like one has to go about trials this way, but the statements were made that vaccines should be placebo controlled or it should be tested against placebo controls. For me, it makes it interesting if I'm a manufacturer, for example, with the next generation of pneumococcal vaccine, what does that mean? Or potentially a next generation flu vaccine. Do you really need to include a vaccine, a placebo-controlled arm in your trial for the vaccine to get approved and then recommended? That borders on unethical in most people's minds, including mine. So I would think and hope that's not the case, but that is a degree of uncertainty for
Yeah,
some like
exactly. In
next
those
generation
instances,
vaccines to think
it
about.
would really be the question then of like an active comparator study, right? Is that fair?
Usually, yeah, absolutely. It's an active
It's got to go
comparator
head to
against,
head against some of these incredible products that are already out there. And so
exactly.
the bar is just super high.
Yeah. But remember, like next generation products, like in the flu space, combination vaccines, for areas where there are already vaccines approved, that's probably the trial design anyway, in some of those cases. But you're right. It's just going to require a shifting of what we believe the minimum bar is. But in most cases, I feel like the manufacturers are probably thinking about that anyway to ensure clinical differentiation and positioning in the future.
Guys, this has been great. Now I'll play time cop a little bit. I know our listeners only have so much time to jam all this content in. So for folks with more questions, please feel free to reach out. But I do want to talk a little bit about sort of CDC recommendations and, when we have approved vaccines that are out there. This is not my interest. Can you guys help us like, this is not like in oncology, the FDA approves stuff and then like professional societies set guidelines. Like that's not how it works here, right? Can you orient like how historically do vaccine schedules and guidelines get set, and how, if at all, is that changing right now?
Yeah. I mean, historically, so within the CDC sits a body called the ACIP. The ACIP was chartered in the 60s, and its basic function is to review data and make recommendations for the entirety of the American population on what vaccines different people should be getting. And historically, what has happened is the ACIP will meet about 3 times a year. They will review whatever vaccines are on the agenda. Sometimes those are things in development. Sometimes they're things that are already approved and they're looking at updates. And they will review the totality of the evidence. They will make a recommendation that says population X should receive vaccine Y. And then the director of the CDC will accept that. And that then gets published as part of the immunization schedule for the US. And the beauty in that is it's been consistent across the entirety of the US. And certainly since the inception of the Affordable Care Act, all payers have been mandated to cover these vaccines if they are recommended by a CIP and then in the immunization schedule for all patients. And so there's never been a question about reimbursement or anything like that. And that's how it's worked, historically up until perhaps today.
Super helpful. And I guess maybe Andrew, I'll ask you, have there been any recent data points that tell us whether or not it's still going to work that way, or whether or not obviously right now we're in a period of headcount transition within CDC. There's gaps in reporting responsibilities. How's it working right now in other areas where it seems like business as usual and areas where maybe there's more uncertainty?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And some of the initial disease areas where there were sort of announcements were on things like chikungunya, which it eventually turned out that it was more business as usual. To your point, chikungunya vaccine was recommended by ACIP, albeit a little bit delayed, and so maybe there is a little bit of sort of delay that could be built in on timelines for manufacturers moving forward, just given the additional scrutiny. However, there's of course the non-zero probability that this has broader implications, and maybe this is an early signal where ACIP could be required to do something very different because of the administration.
I mean, I think we're seeing that today, even at that same ACIP meeting where chikungunya was reviewed. They also reviewed recommendations for RSV, and the ACIP said we recommend expanding RSV vaccinations down to 50, I think from the existing 64. That recommendation has not as yet been accepted by the CDC. And I think the word is in the background that some of the deputy director folks at the CDC are going back to the ACIP and the manufacturers asking for more data to justify vaccination in that population. And it remains to be seen what will happen there. But there's clearly more scrutiny being put on this. Not just sort of accepting the ACIP recommendations. And I think it is a signal to manufacturers that you will have to consider this if you're, coming to the ACIP and the ACIP in the near term, that it's not just those members of the ACIP you have to convince, it's others in the sort of CDC and administration as well.
Super helpful. It does sound as if there's more uncertainty than there has been for maybe 50 or 60 years in terms of the reliability of convincing ACIP to make a recommendation, that translating into formal CDC policy. Seth, this is now a really hypothetical world. I know we've covered a lot of changing pieces on sort of like the commercial side of the equation for vaccines. I know we had the white paper you guys put out recently around the increasing role of the retail pharmacists. For listeners, you should absolutely grab a copy of that if you haven't yet. But for my benefit, like in a future world where you get an FDA approval and ACIP recommendation sort of like get held up, like what are the implications in terms of actually getting a new product into the hands of, or I guess making it accessible to patients, to at-risk populations, giving practitioners the choice? Like, how does this change the commercial model, and like how much of a worst case scenario is this for vaccine players if ACIP recommendations become less reliable?
Yeah, I like that question because I think this is where it gets a little bit interesting to just start to project forward and think through what a worst case scenario could look like. And is it all doom and gloom for vaccines? I think the answer is no. In terms of activities as a manufacturer, for a novel vaccine, a lot would remain the same. Maybe it's just a stronger push on them, going to those medical societies, making sure there are recommendations in their guidelines. The sales and marketing, direct to consumer, at least in the US, again, you want to push hard on that to make sure people are aware of your vaccine and seeking it out because of the clinical value that the vaccine brings. But in addition to that, and I think one of the major questions that would be on people's minds relates to, I think, Kai, what you said, where as of today, if a vaccine is recommended, payers have to cover it. And if the CDC decides not to make a recommendation, then what happens? And at least in my mind, I still think there's a path forward for vaccines. And the way I think about it is actually leaving vaccines for a moment, but thinking about other prophylactic products and how they've been covered. And the most obvious one, at least to me, is in HIV, where you have PrEP or pre-exposure prophylaxis. You have products like Descovy and Apretude, and those are covered by payers fairly broadly. So it's not an issue. And can that be the case for vaccines in this future? I don't see why not. Another example would be Synagis, which is a prophylactic for the most part, premature infants for RSV. And again, that was recommended by the Pediatric Society, I forget which one, and it was covered broadly according to those guidelines by payers. So I don't think it's the end of the world if you have an FDA-approved vaccine and either ACIP doesn't review it, or even if ACIP reviews it, presumably positively, and CDC just doesn't make a decision. I still think there is a path forward for vaccines. It's just thinking through how do you get there and how do you manage it when it's not automatically covered.
Yeah.
Seth, what I heard you say, and Andrew and Kai, I want you guys to chime in, is in a world where ACIP is not functioning the way it has historically, or there's uncertainty there, it seems like the time and energy you spend developing alternate clinician guideline channels or champions is arguably the most disproportionate piece, right? So that there's difficulty in payers limiting access, and so that there's sort of a ground up swell of adoption. I guess, Kai and Andrew, that's the topic we see in and outside of the vaccine world increasingly, the importance of strong KOL engagement and guideline and pushing for clear guidance from the expert community back to the broader. Would you agree that's the biggest piece that rises to the forefront here as you think about future market strategy planning for innovators in this space, or are there others you'd highlight as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. It absolutely heightens the importance of engaging the KOL community, because traditionally, not to say that manufacturers didn't engage them, but they effectively did by proxy through the ACIP, which is comprised of some of the top experts in the space. I think the other thing also to recognize, even though it is different but somewhat related, manufacturers, especially in certain ex-US markets, probably had to pursue sort of unique or sort of different commercialization channels in the first place. So going through the private channel, market or segment of the market in certain countries where the ACIP equivalent bodies decided it wasn't cost effective to recommend, figuring out how to engage, those different stakeholders outside of sort of the more ACIP-like, pathways. So not to say it's the same magnitude in the US, but I think those types of tactics, can be explored and can be, sort of taken from other disease areas as well as what I'm sure, the companies have learned from trying to commercialize in certain ex-US markets as well.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, we've gone longer than we meant, but no problem from my vantage point. I've really enjoyed the conversation and appreciate all you guys have weighed in on it. It does sound as if the heyday of the pandemic world, terrible language to use if I'm candid, but that we really are seeing a tightening of controls, and the real uncertainty is around how CDC reform, functional staffing pieces actually affect the reliability of ACIP recommendations. This is something I'll just say, some of the work I do on the investor and private equity side of the equation, we see this question a lot too around reliability of function, and trying to understand how much of the DOGE pressure on FDA and CDC is truly cost savings and just populist message versus how much is actually creating headspace to drive adoption of AI workflows and streamline things. And, you've got Macri out there saying, no, we're going to see a huge rush second half of the year. So a lot to stay tuned to there, but it does sound as if in the meanwhile, folks should make contingency plans to build their own championship in the marketplace. But beyond that, it doesn't seem that the regulatory bar is moving that significantly from where it was historically, and that the door is not being closed anytime soon for innovative vaccines. So with that, I'll say any parting thoughts from the three of you guys? Anything, if you were in our audience's shoes thinking about how to optimize your vaccine portfolios, any other top of mind guidance as we wrap things up?
I think it just, at the end of the day, we fundamentally believe vaccines remain an attractive commercial proposition, as well as not to say anything of the sort of public health benefits they bring. It's just going to require probably planning more for longer timelines, greater capital controls around that to actually do things efficiently and effectively. And honestly, probably looking outside the US more so than historically. Historically, vaccines have been more so than other therapeutic areas, really US heavy in terms of their price point and the volume. And maybe it's time to look sort of broader for some of these and recognize the commercial potential of markets in Europe, Asia, and otherwise to really capture that value.
Agreed. Couldn't said it better, Kai. I agree.
Yeah, I think I fully agree. Remain bullish on the scientific value proposition, the clinical value proposition. It's just going to require potentially slightly different commercial models moving forward.
Andrew, not to mention the pharmacoeconomics too.
Exactly.
An ounce of prevention goes a long way. Gentlemen, thank you guys for the time on this one. To our audience, appreciate you guys joining week 2 or session 2 now. ClearView Convos, we've got more to come, so please stay tuned. Send us feedback, tell us what you like and don't, name of the topics you'd like us to lean into. As I mentioned too, if you haven't grabbed this group's white paper on the rising role of the retail pharmacist on the commercial side, don't miss that as well. On behalf of Kai, Andrew, and Seth, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Cheers.